So the various brownfield resources can be layered with other brownfield resources as well as other funding, and often are, since different resources are available at different times. So you can also come in and out of the brownfield program. For instance, you might just need a phase 1 assessment, that research report on the property, in order to make the decision to purchase the site or to pass on it. Or you might request a phase 2 on a property you want to purchase, and then the results come back that the soil and groundwater sampling show contamination above with what you're comfortable dealing with. It is okay at that point to leave the brownfield program. Just note that if those results are submitted to DEQ, either because we paid for the work or because it's required to be reported based on our regulatory process, we're going to then work with the responsible party, most likely the owner, to address that contamination. All right, so I learn best with examples, so I wanted to give you a few of those. One example of a brownfield project is the Falstaff Brewery in New Orleans, which applied to the Regional Planning Commission's Brownfield program to conduct a phase 1 assessment and then also do a lead and asbestos survey so they could figure out how much cleanup would be needed. Because the site was enrolled in our local brownfield program, the LDEQ Brownfield Coordinator at the time assisted with addressing LDEQ liens on the property related to the improper disposal of asbestos. LDEQ ensured that the person who caused the contamination was still held liable and still had to pay, but the sale and the redevelopment of the site could move forward. So once the sale occurred, the private developer who purchased it was able to use other funding sources to complete the investigation and all the necessary cleanup because that worked better for their timeline. And the site is now a mixed-use affordable housing development. The Lindy Boggs Medical Center is another example. St. Margaret's Foundation conducted their own phase 1 assessment before purchasing the property. They then applied to the City of New Orleans Brownfield Program, who developed an investigation plan. That plan was then implemented underneath the Regional Planning Commission's Brownfield Program because at the time the city didn't have enough brownfield funds to actually execute the plan. For the actual cleanup, St. Margaret's applied for and received a direct cleanup grant from EPA because they're a nonprofit entity. They also received a loan and 2 grants from the City of New Orleans Brownfield Cleanup Revolving Loan Fund. And then they also received cleanup assistance from LDEQ's Brownfield program. So a lot of layering going on there. A private developer is also layering funding to redevelop the old federal courthouse in downtown Lafayette. The project includes a subaward from LDEQ to the Acadiana Planning Commission to support the investigation work. And then they also received a cleanup loan from the Brownfield Cleanup Revolving Loan Fund Coalition, the one I mentioned, managed by South Central Planning, to offset the cost of addressing the asbestos in the buildings. While I would like to tell you, layering the brownfield funding is straightforward. Everything comes out clean and neat. It actually requires normally a lot of back and forth, trying to figure out what will work best and when, what resources are available and when, while also addressing all the strings that come attached with government funding. The good news is we're here to help you navigate that process and determine what resources might be available for your project. So you can either contact your local brownfield coordinator or you can contact me to see what resources are available that might meet your timeline. I've included links in the various brownfield programs as well as my contact information in the helpful links handout. Just note right now we're in the process of rebuilding all the local brownfield programs, but we're really hoping the development community will pitch in and help us identify target areas that will make compelling cases for funding applications so we can increase the amount of brownfield resources in the state overall. One other resource that's not currently available but that we're hoping to revive is the Louisiana Brownfields Investor Tax Credit. This was one of the first and honestly one of the best state brownfield tax credits. It provided a 15% state tax credit for environmental investigation work at brownfield sites and 50% credit for cleanup costs. It did require that the site be enrolled in LDEQ's Voluntary Remediation program, which I'm going to talk about next. It couldn't be claimed by someone who was considered responsible for the contamination, but the credit could be carried forward for 10 years, or it could be transferred to another eligible entity, which worked out really well for nonprofit and government entities that don't incur state tax liability. Unfortunately, the credit sunsetted in 2009. There was an attempt to reinstate the credit a few years ago, and although the bill passed with overwhelming support in both the state, House, and Senate, it was vetoed by the previous governor. It was at the time where tax credits really weren't looked on favorably. There has been renewed interest in reinstating the credit, so I'm mentioning it as it will probably need a wide range of support from the development community in order to pass. The final resource I'm going to talk about today to facilitate the reuse of vacant and abandoned sites is LDEQ's Voluntary Remediation Program, also called the VRP. The VRP is a prescriptive process that requires more investigation work up front and may take a little bit more time, but it allows more flexibility at the cleanup stage, which can save both time and money. So LDEQ's VRP provides applicants the ability to receive a certificate of completion once they successfully remediate the site following the VRP requirements, as well as a release of liability for applicants and future site owners for all past contamination. So both responsible and non-responsible parties are eligible to apply, and this can really help facilitate the sale of properties that are contaminated or probably contaminated, but the current owner who might be responsible is fearful of future liability. So through the VRP, they can receive a release of liability, which might make them more comfortable in actually selling the property to get it back into commerce. Non-responsible parties who aren't liable for the contamination may also be able to address environmental concerns with engineering or institutional controls that I mentioned earlier. So again, an example of an engineering control is using a parking lot or building foundation to cap soil with asbestos. So the main issue with asbestos is people breathing in asbestos fibers, which then get into their lungs. Capping the asbestos that's in soil prevents people from being exposed to the fibers. We call this blocking the exposure pathway so people aren't exposed to the contamination. So a parking lot or a building foundation can cap that contamination. There is a requirement for a maintenance plan to make sure that stays in place, but that's preventing people from actually being exposed to the asbestos. So an example of an institutional control is a conveyance notice to restrict groundwater usage if there's contamination in the groundwater. So, for example, Gulf Coast Scrap redeveloped the former Haywalt galvanizing facility in Harvey that had an issue of zinc contamination from prior operations in both the soil and the groundwater. Because they were enrolled in the VRP and not responsible for the contamination, they cleaned up the soil to remove the source of the contamination and then put a conveyance notice on the property to prohibit the use of groundwater at the site, which in effect blocks the exposure pathway from people drinking contaminated water. So this was in lieu of cleaning up the groundwater to meet state standards, which would have been cost prohibitive and would have killed the redevelopment project. The elevated levels of zinc in groundwater will still be addressed by LDEQ's other regulatory programs, but Gulf Coast Scrap isn't liable for that cost, and they were able to move forward with the redevelopment of the site. So both engineering and institutional controls can help reduce cleanup costs and make the redevelopment economically viable, while also preventing people's exposure to contamination. So basically a win-win. One of the other benefits of the VRP is that the assessment and remediation activities are limited to the boundaries of the site that's defined by the applicant, which can reduce investigation and cleanup costs. So for example, if someone wants to purchase a former gas station that had a leaking underground storage tank where the plume extends off-site, they can just address the contamination within the boundaries of the former gas station under the VRP if they define their site boundaries to correspond with the legal property description. This can move the site to redevelopment quicker and at a lower cost than if they had to address the entire plume of contamination. LDEQ will continue to address the plume under our normal regulatory process, but redevelopment of the site can move forward. As I mentioned, the applicant defines the site boundaries in their VRP application. So you can choose, like in the last example, to use the legal boundaries of the site, or you can also define a smaller area within a larger parcel as your VRP site. So if you have a large parcel you're interested in, let's say it's 10 acres, but there's a 2 acre section of contamination that the current owner is especially concerned about for future liability, you can limit your VRP site to just that area, which can reduce your investigation costs and then address the other parts of the site through the traditional environmental process. So it's up to you to define the boundaries of your VRP site in the application. All right, that's just a general overview. I could do a whole presentation just on the VRP. So if you have questions on if the voluntary remediation program would be a good fit for your site, or you would like additional information, please feel free to contact me. We're hoping to have training sessions on it in the future. One final note though on the VRP, if you complete the process, you also get a certificate of completion ceremony, which is pictured here for the Gulf Coast scrap site that I mentioned earlier. One of the things I really like about this site is how they utilized reused materials in the building. So Gulf Coast Scrap has a salvage part to their business. So in addition to reusing as much of the existing building as they were able to, many of the building components came from other structures that they had demoed or salvaged, such as the metal columns that are holding up the building, one of the internal staircases, and the 30-foot tall warehouse doors, which came from another warehouse. I think that was from New Orleans East. And after attending one of our Brownfield workshops on other sustainable ways to redevelop sites, they actually incorporated in permeable pavement and a bioswale into their parking area. So it's not as fancy as a historic downtown property renovation, but it is still a great reuse project. And as you can see in the photo, Dr. Brown, the current LDEQ secretary, presented them with their certificate of completion and their Brownfield Award. And what I especially like is standing next to Dr. Brown are Christine and Craig's parents, who kind of spurred them on to this life of reusing things and bringing things back to life. So it's important to remember that Brownfields assistance is one piece of the redevelopment puzzle. So it's designed to address the environmental issues at a site. It doesn't automatically make the site marketable or help with acquiring the property or redeveloping the property once the environmental issues are addressed. And that's why it's really important that we have all the people who are hopefully listening in on board and working together to complete the puzzle from site acquisition all the way through redevelopment and executing the reuse. It's also helpful to have the project team involved in the environmental process early on, so the environmental folks understand and coordinate with the other funding and development deadlines and requirements, and the other project partners understand the environmental process and constraints at a site. So that's a general overview of some of the resources available to address environmental issues to facilitate the redevelopment of historic properties. If you have any questions or you would like information on anything I covered, please feel free to contact me. Thanks for listening in, and I look forward to working with you in the future.